I'm the chair of the Department of Art and Art History here at Hunter College. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening and to be able to welcome Pablo Helgura to Hunter College and the Department of Art and Art History to this, as this semester's Foundation to Life Arthur and Carol Kaufman Goldberg Visiting Curator. Before I formally introduce Pablo, I would like to express my sincere thanks to Carol and Arthur Goldberg, who are here with us this evening. They have been steadfast supporters of the department, the art galleries, and students and faculty throughout Hunter College. The curatorial workshops Carol and Arthur have made possible are designed to bring curators of international stature to the Hunter campus to work with students in the MA program in art history and the MFA program in studio art, who are themselves engaged in and by issues of contemporary curatorial practice. Pablo Helgura is the 6th Foundation to Life curator, following Ann Goldstein of the Art Institute of Chicago, Hamza Walker of LAX Art, Fabrice Straum, former director of the Kunsthalle Bern, Valerie Castle-Oliver of the Contemporary Art Museum Houston, and Omar Khalif of the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago. Hunter's art faculty and both art historians and artists have long been committed to curating as a mode of research. They understand that exhibitions and exhibition programming can and indeed should make cogent arguments and produce new knowledge. This year marks the first official year of our graduate curatorial certificate, formalizing a tradition of student and faculty exhibition making at Hunter that is now nearly 3 decades old. The Goldberg support has been integral to making the certificate a reality and to making possible numerous exhibitions over the years. Please watch for 2 curatorial certificate exhibitions opening in the fall, a retrospective of the San Francisco-based artist collective Future Farmers at Hunter East Harlem Gallery, curated by Paul Ramirez Jonas, Arden Sherman, and their students, and Framing Communities Magnum Photography 1947 to the present in the Lubsdorff Gallery in Hunter's main campus on 68th Street, curated by Antonella Pellizzari, Sarah Watson, and their students. And again, it is Carol and Arthur's gift that has made these immersive and hands-on educational experiences possible and has ensured that such opportunities will continue for our curatorial students for years to come. Please join me in thanking them. On the front page of this morning's New York Times print edition, there was this teaser for an article inside. Quote, "In a tumultuous era, some museums rush to embrace the political while others deliberately retreat." This could well describe many of our students in the aftermath of the campaign and the election. Many have been engaged by a renewed sense of activism and public political engagement. Others have embedded themselves even more fully in their work. These are both commitments. The one thing that came through as a clear and shared concern, a demand really, was for spaces in which to meet and talk. There has been a real desire for an ongoing dialogue on meaning, on community, and on responsibility in our new tumultuous era. Exhibitions currently up at 2 of Hunter's art galleries speak to that now seemingly urgent need to have a place to gather, to make connections and interventions, however fleeting. If you haven't had a chance to, I urge you to visit the exhibition downstairs in the 205 Hudson Gallery, Elective Affinities, a Library, curated by Sarah Watson and Jocelyn Spar, which imagines the gallery, as the title says, as a library or reading room, a place for readings, screenings, and conversations around questions of family and community. And at Hunter's East Harlem Gallery, Pablo Helgura, together with Danielle Tediger, Arden Sherman, and students in the Goldberg Curatorial Workshop, have opened the Incoherence Salon, dedicated to the spirit of Les Incohérents, a pioneering avant-garde experiment of Paris of the 1880s. As described by its founder, Jules Levy, quote, "The incoherent is a painter or a bookseller, a poet or a bureaucrat, or a sculptor, but what distinguishes him is the fact that the moment he surrenders to his incoherence, he prefers to pass for what he is not. The bookseller becomes a tenor, a painter writes verses, the architect discusses free trade. all with exuberance, close quote. Thus, the gallery at the Silberman School of Social Work has been remade as a theater and salon and will host a series of events and interventions over the next month programmed by Pablo and his team, poetry readings, lectures, a stage play, each designed to rigorously and in its own way come apart at the seams. Preferring to pass for what he is not, or better, preferring not to be defined by a single role, Pablo Helgura has worked in modern and contemporary art museums for nearly 25 years. He served as the head of public programs at the Education Department of the Guggenheim Museum in New York from 1998 to 2005, and was appointed to his current position as Director of Adult and Academic Programs at the Museum of Modern Art in 2007. Over that time, he has organized almost 1,000 public events in conjunction with nearly 100 exhibitions. He has worked closely alongside curators and in between them and in the spaces they don't usually occupy. It may be that Pablo is not technically a curator, as he wrote to us in response to our invitation, although in many museums, the position he occupies at MoMA bears the title Curator of Education. Etymologically, after all, the term curator descends from curare, to take care, originally not of objects, but of flocks, of parishioners, or of children, and now perhaps of groups of people, of lectures and events and conversations. This is the educational and outreach work of the museum, and one our students in particular are very much engaged in, particularly insofar as it engages their own practice as curators, museum educators, art historians, and artists. Pablo is also an artist, and his work as an educator in the museum clearly intersects with his artistic practice, which often takes the form of a lecture or engages in strategies of museum display. As an artist, his work addresses questions of history, ethnography, language, and memory, and reflects on issues of interpretation, dialogue, and the role of contemporary culture in global reality. That is, one could say, on the work of the museum. Pablo wrote on his Facebook the other day that this is the very first chance he has had in 25 years to publicly speak about the obscure art of the public program. I won't put that off any longer. Please join me in welcoming Pablo Helgura.
Thank you, Howard. I'm very grateful to be here for Howard's invitation to be here with you, to Hunter College, and of course to Arthur and Carol Goldberg, who made this visiting professorship possible. And like we said, I did tell Howard when I was invited, I am not a curator. I am an artist and an educator. And my job is to develop and present public programs in museums that have a pedagogical and a interpretive nature. I very much respect the curatorial profession, and on my daily life, I work with curators both inside and outside my museum capacity. To the extent that I would never, or could never in good conscience, call myself a curator. But at the same time, I recognize that the hybrid job that I have performed for 3 decades inside museums bears a great deal of affinity to the curatorial practice. So much so that curators usually resort to it on a regular basis, and ways that I will discuss tonight. And the transformations of the art practice over the last decades include the influence of institutional critique, have made the live event a natural extension of the exhibition, and at times, the exhibition itself. So I'm very happy to speak about this subject, an obscure subject like Howard mentioned. But first I want to do a little disclaimer. It is not possible to share in one single presentation all the complexities of the curatorial practice of the public program, in the same way that you could not really talk about the curatorial practice in one single hour. I would like to share a few thoughts about why it is important to think about it today, how I see its components, and I will speak tonight about value, about content and form, and about the role of the anecdote. I will also end with this image, a typical art historical image, which you might recognize, a print by Albrecht Dürer, The Holy Family with the Mayfly from 1495. You might wonder, why am I showing you this image? But I'm going to keep you in suspense. And sometimes suspense is good in a public program. All this will be known by the end. But first, I would like to offer a little biographical preface. I was born in Mexico City in 1971 to a rather atypical family, middle-class family of writers and classical musicians. I grew up listening to debates about poetry and the work of Stravinsky and Prokofiev, about Debussy and Beethoven quartets. My father read Chekhov and the Spanish novelist Benito Pérez Galdós. My brother was a poet and a philosopher. He obsessively studied Heidegger and Husserl, and because he was much older than me, he would bring me and try to explain to me what he was reading, generating in me a great interest in phenomenology. Although in retrospect, my brother, who was the more sophisticated thinker, was interested in ideas, I was more pedestrian. I was interested in people and their stories. In retrospect, looking at those years, there was one experience that would inform my artistic life more than anything, and which also prepared me in very unsuspected ways for my current museum professional life, something that I could have never anticipated. It actually had to do with my mother's sister, my aunt, Elena Lizalde. My aunt Elena worked for Radio Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, known also as Radio UNAM. It's the radio station of the National University of Mexico. She was the director of public programs of the Sala Julián Carrillo of Radio UNAM, a small auditorium with around 120 seats, which was designed and opened in 1976. I will never forget the really comfortable orange seats of that auditorium. Very nice wooden stage. My aunt was an attractive and a hyperactive woman, always dressed impeccably, whose job was to program that auditorium. She was indefatigable, constantly working with embassies and every other cultural organization in Mexico to develop and present lectures, performances, screenings, and other events at that auditorium. Now, the UNAM, which is probably the most important university in Latin America, has never been particularly adept at publicity, being as it was subsidized by the state. This meant that most of the times my aunt's events were attended by nobody. This often resulted in my aunt frantically calling my mom on a regular basis, trying to encourage us to come to her events. I was an 11-year-old around that time and would often become the guinea pig for whatever she was organizing. She would pick me up into her car and take me to the auditorium. That's how I spent many evenings of my early teenage years watching all of Ingmar Bergman's films, Luis Buñuel, Marcel Pagnol, as well as Charlie Chaplin, Harold Lloyd, and others, in this empty auditorium, orange auditorium. Only me and the projectionist were present. He and I became friends. It was like Cinema Paradiso, Colonia del Valle version. I saw Octavio Paz, the Nobel Prize, read for the first time on that stage. I attended lectures by major artists and writers of the time in Mexico. That orange stage became truly my personal school. My aunt would always stand in the back of the auditorium, nervous, worrying always that the program would go well. But the most poignant memory that I have of those events is actually at the end of each program, when the crowd would empty the auditorium, and I would remain with my aunt, who was always the last one to leave, and see her pick up the flowers that decorated the stage and turn off the lights. Little did I know that this would become, actually, my professional life, becoming a producer of public programs. After organizing more than 2,000 programs in my lifetime, I still retain that tendency, never since forgotten, to always nervously stand at the back of the room to make sure that all goes well. And I do think of my aunt at that moment of being the last one leaving the auditorium, turning off the lights, leaving with the sense that you're leaving the energy that was projected for the space of 2 hours, shared with humanity, floating in the dark, upholstered room. I first want to say a word about art objects and art events, a comment on value and on the personal meaning of stories and how public programs bring these together. In her book, 7 Days in the Art World, Sarah Thornton describes the opening of the Venice Biennial with the incisive observations and the analytical eye of an anthropologist. In the book, she writes about how after the opening weekend, the biennial is pretty much over for the art world intelligentsia. Those who have traveled to see the work, make a judgment, and then go home, maybe to the next art fair or biennial. The following 3 or 4 months are kind of afterthoughts. They are of course important to attend by the huge crowds, cultural tourism, and the stray art professionals that are behind in the news. But for all practical purposes, the biennial is now something of the past. It becomes time to look at the next international event. Thornton's spot-on commentary fits in my mind with an anecdote referred by no other than Andy Warhol himself in Popisms. At Warhol's retrospective in Philadelphia in 1965, the artist was already so famous that huge crowds came to the event and were trying to get in the gallery. This is the picture of the opening. And the museum staff was so nervous about this huge crowd that they had to actually take down the artworks as a safety measure against a human avalanche. So this huge amount of people were working into this completely empty gallery, right? To see his retrospective. Warhol and his collaborators then entered when they were received by the hysterical mass of adoring fans. Remembering this episode in his book, Warhol remarks on the irony that there was nothing to see in the gallery other than he and his collaborators. He says, quote, "We weren't just at the art exhibit. We were the art exhibit. We were the art incarnate." There's a term connected to this period also, a couple years later, published in 1967, presented in a pejorative sense by art historian Michael Fried, theatricality. In his very well-known essay, Art and Objecthood, Fried famously criticizes a group of works of a kind that we later will term minimalism, by considering that the extreme self-consciousness of the artist results in something that you call theatricality. 50 years after Fried's essay, we can safely conclude that this act of self-awareness that produced minimalism and many other conceptual or process-based practices actually helped break art into new realms. Fried is suspicious of the object that knows too much, perhaps. It's an object that escapes the reader, the viewer, because it's not unaware of itself. And its self-awareness presents a huge problem for the interpreter. It disempowers us because it is performing. It's behaving badly in an unwieldy way, making the job of the art critic difficult. I bring up the Warhol and the Fried references because both connect to the fact that sometime around the 1960s, there's already a recognition that the performative is somehow, intentionally or unintentionally, starting to displace the art objects. As I tried to develop in a previous book about the sociology of the art world, titled Art Scenes, I argued that the art discourse in general, we always place a great deal, of course, of attention to the art object. We discuss its components, its problems, its confines, but we spend much less time discussing the art experience as a cognitive and a sensorial and a social process, which might be primarily informed by the art object, but is also aided by, and sometimes replaced by, the experience itself, which is of a performative, anecdotal, and narrative nature. In my book, I argue about the role that extrinsic and intrinsic value play in art. Intrinsic value can be understood, in general terms, as whatever inherent characteristics may exist in an artwork. These are, technically speaking, the characteristics that never change. They make the work to have its identity, something like the artwork's soul, the DNA. But while we might suspect or be certain that these things are there, that this value exists, it's very difficult to explain or prove that it's there in an objective way. We know that certain artworks are important, but there's no scientific way to explain why they are so. That no objective way of establishing why an artwork becomes more viral or more influential than another. There are some theories that are more accepted than others, but theories are never definitive. They are challenged sooner or later. Whatever we deem very important right now might not be important tomorrow. In contrast, extrinsic value is very easy to determine, as it deals with the concrete effects that certain artworks have in the world. It deals with the facts of what actually the thing is and what it does. We know that certain artworks created a controversy. We know who wrote about it. We know who was claimed to be directly inspired to do something in response. We know how many times they have been Googled, reproduced. We know how much they have been sold for. We know what kind of effect they have had in the art market. So since we cannot know what intrinsic value is, we know it's there, but we really can't point our finger exactly where, the art discourse becomes a lot about the extrinsic. It's about the artwork is received and discussed, how the concrete ideas and actions it generates, how it dominates conversations, how it captures the collective mind, and what concrete responses are made either by artists who make more artworks in response or by other kinds of actions. And this consensus is developed through the communication process, which is social, which is live, which is circumstantial. All key aspects of the performative and all, of course, key aspects of the public program. So it goes without saying that Warhol would have hardly become the artist he became had he only been showing up to empty galleries. And also goes without saying that a biennial that would open only for a weekend would hardly generate the investment of attention of the entire art world. An interesting case was Ivo Mesquita's 28th Sao Paulo Biennial in 2008, which included an entirely empty second floor of 30,000 square meters of the biennial pavilion, which was a very brave and controversial gesture, something that Mesquita wanted to do to kind of implement a criticism on the state of art making at this moment. In the end, it was impossible, and as I understand it, he wanted to have the entire biennial completely open. It was also a protest for not having enough budget to do the biennial. But it was really impossible for the foundation to really support an entirely empty biennial. Some art had to be included somewhere, and he also wanted to include only conversations. To him, it was about a conversation about the void. But to be clear, I don't really mean to dismiss the value of the art object. I am simply pointing out the way in which the anecdotal events frame the art experience and how this framing translates into the edged experience that we carry within ourselves. Also, I'm aware that there's a difference between the viewing experience as an event and the discursive public program, which is a constructed event, a curated event. But I think it is important to consider this relationship. When we experience art and we are impacted by it, our impulse is to share the experience with others. We want to talk about it. We want to share how it makes us feel, what it makes us think of. Ideally, we want to get close to the intrinsic value through extrinsic strategies, mainly conversation. We will have to recur to language to communicate about art, to rationalize its meanings to ourselves and others. And words, when we are trying to talk about art, about images, inevitably fail us, because words can never truly replace an image. They only offer temporary or tentative insights. It's a conversation. It's a discussion where what dominates is the most is the points of view and interpretations of facts. And the consensus that emerges from that discussion is what might become the draft of our history. As a museum educator who never gets to select the works on view, I have grown accustomed to the fact that this selection aspect is completely out of my hands. My job constitutes specifically, perhaps in the sense of being an editor, extracting the most interesting or relevant ideas that can be discussed about an exhibition, the artist's life, the works. My passion isn't decoding that conversation. The question of whether I'm personally interested on the artwork or the artist at hand is completely irrelevant to the process. It's like being a surgeon attending a human being. It doesn't matter as a surgeon whether that person is good or bad, or has a bad personality, or likes cheesecake or something else. You still operate, and it's just a person, right? What does matter a great deal is what elements I can find to make an art viewing experience relevant to an audience. In literature, as in theater, what makes a novel or play valuable or fascinating is not necessarily or exclusively the plot, but the way in which it's told. And this is a modernist lesson. Perhaps the most important novel of the 20th century, which is Joyce's Ulysses, revolves around a perfectly boring and banal day in the life of the main character, Mr. Leopold Bloom. This idea that a simple story can be developed in a myriad forms is perfectly developed by Raymond Queneau's Exercises in Style from 1947. So we know that modernism was a revolution in form, of course. But what remained to be developed with that revolution was the idea of experience as form, as I will try to explain. I want to first argue that, and this might get complicated, that the beliefs and opinions that we develop about the intrinsic value of certain artworks are usually nothing other than memories of extrinsic experiences in and of themselves. This is hard to understand, so I will have to turn back to the autobiographical. My first encounter with Picasso was the inaugural exhibition of the Museo Tamayo in Mexico City in the early 80s, when I was taken by my father to see the works. It was titled The Picassos of Picasso. And the show had a deep impact on me. It immediately set me in a direction towards art making. But I had never seen the great majority of those paintings again. I can hardly even remember, with the exception of maybe 2 works, what I actually saw. They were not, by the way, Picasso's greatest works, by the way, because they will not have been allowed to travel to Mexico probably. All that is left is a memory of the event, the fact that this event took place, but most importantly, the reaction that it produced in me. Which reminds me of a phrase by Maya Angelou: people might not remember exactly what you did or what you say, but they will always remember how you made them feel. This is true of art. And the art experience is, to me, ultimately, and in general terms, an event. We misremember details, but we never misremember feelings. Secondly, we know how art makes us feel, but as human beings, we want clarity. We want rational explanation about these feelings that art is provoking in us. Why do I feel this way? Why does this feel sad? Why does this makes me uncomfortable? I don't really understand it, people ask. I am often faced in gallery sessions when I am with a group of people in a gallery in the museum, especially tourist groups who come to me. They simply ask me to tell them what the work is about. Just tell me. I just want to know what it is. As if every artwork had a perfect explanation on the back with the ingredients, the meaning, the things that you should think about when you look at them. As if all these things could be really easily decoded and downloaded onto your brain. The issue is that this quest of facts and wanting to reach scientific precision about an artist, an artwork, an art movement, this search of content that we unsuspectingly absorb most of the time is formed through emotional or cognitive processes. I will provide another example that I posed to our students last week. In 1917, at the University of South Carolina School of Medicine, students of psychiatry and psychology were giving a lecture by a fictional Dr. Myron L. Fox, who was in reality an actor, but the students did not know this. They were simply told that they were being told a lecture by this famous Dr. Myron L. Fox. The title of his lecture was Mathematical Game Theory as Applied to Physician Education. The material presented was completely nonsensical and meaningless, all gibberish, full of non sequiturs, parenthetical comments, jokes, and it was delivered with such great confidence, charisma, humor, and warmth that the students gave very positive feedback for the lecture. They thought it was a fantastic lecture, although he specifically had made an effort to say absolutely nothing. This is to mean that in this case, the form, that is the performative delivery, the successful nonverbal communication of this professional actor was having, and the expressiveness of the lecture had completely replaced the content by just a feeling of content. So to summarize, the art experience, as I said before, has a performative, a narrative, and anecdotal nature, all of which are, again, components of the public program. We owe an important debt, of course, to institutional critique and the postmodern moment for this moment of self-awareness that we have about events, which were characterized by creating narrative and experiential discourses where there's a deep self-awareness that often results in the conceptual appropriation of social structures, institutional models, validation, etc. The most immediate example that will come to mind is perhaps Marcel Rota's Museum of Modern Art, Department of Eagles, and the way that he, Rotas, was appropriating the entire language, the exhibition language, the educational language, the official language of the museum to create lectures, events, tours, publications, and everything that becomes kind of like the typical frame of validation of the artistic narrative, right? And other examples, I mean, we can go on, we can talk about Hans Hacke's political work that exposes political structures. We can talk about John Cage's lectures on nothing. But I think another interesting example is the legendary artist and also hunter, recently retired professor Robert Morris, who in 1963 presented this video in which an actor is performing this art historical lecture by Edwin Panofsky, the famous art historian, but he's lip syncing the actual soundtrack with the actual voice of Panofsky. So you can hear Panofsky doing this grandiose history of art lecture with this actor simply moving his lips in sync with the actual sound. And of course, the natural development of all this, which is Andrea Fraser's museum, highlights the full appropriation of the persona of the art educator that goes into the galleries and then completely mixes art with critique. You know? The logical development of institutional critique, politically focused art, and art informed by feminism and identity politics, as well as the work of the 90s, like Ricci Trevania's work, that is sometimes identified as relational aesthetics, is, in my view, the set of practices that today are generally described with the label, or develops into what we now understand as socially engaged art. What seems most important to me about the artists included in this category, to which I have often been subscribed in the past, is precisely this acute self-awareness of the social and the political context within which we work. This awareness makes us want to break away, even if temporarily, from the institutional frame of art, specifically the gallery space. And this is an example of a major artist, Susan Lacey, who decided to make this work in Oakland with teenagers and the police, kind of staging a conference in a garage. This is why it's so difficult to create an exhibition about social practice, and the two don't go hand in hand. Either one creates an archival representation and interpretation of a life experience, or one lives the experience directly, without the museum as intermediary. So I consider these previously mentioned things relevant because, in my opinion, these critical attitudes of the venue of the museum and institutional structures of validation in art, as well as importance placed on the experience, have triggered the desire to think of the social or communication event as the main medium of art making. This is to say that socially engaged art is committed mostly to the construction of the experience, the expectation that a certain kind of emancipation will occur beyond the traditional experiencing of a performance piece or the nominal participation in an interactive work. It's a desire of going deeper or earnestly engaging with the participant and making them meaningful interlocutors, not merely passive receptors. This is an example of some of the programs that I do at the museum. This one is called Agora, inspired on a form of programming known as Socrates Café, started by a French philosopher in Paris in the 90s. It consists simply of creating a group of people, started in a cafe in Paris, where the philosopher would simply ask a question, an open-ended question: is life worth living? And using the Socratic method to jumpstart a conversation. These are questions that are not, don't have necessarily an answer. These are not questions like, when was Picasso born? This is really more of like important philosophical debates that don't really have any necessarily conclusion. With the purpose to really have people reflect on a particular problem. And the reason why we do them in the sculpture garden is precisely because we're not confined by the galleries. We're not confined to looking at a single artwork. We're there to reflect on the experience that we have had and think about art in larger terms. And then using the Socratic method, you continue asking and elaborating questions. Things like, should art be preserved forever? Yes or no? What are the advantages, what are the disadvantages of preserving art? Can art be preserved at all? Things like that. But from the standpoint of the curator and the producer, the interest in the event emerges, I believe, from the generally intuitive recognition that the static presentation of objects does not suffice in order to provoke critical reflection of the value of the artistic ideas presented. It is partially a desire to jumpstart a discussion about it, to test new thoughts and conversations. In a superficial and perhaps frivolous way, the public program becomes a means of promotion, as in the artist gallery talk after the opening of the show, the press preview, or whatever. But it can also be an opportunity to place an artistic idea in center stage. Social media has now started to displace this routine. Yet in the same way that some of us believed back in 2000 or so that the new media would eventually displace the physical presentation of art, we perhaps underestimated the conservative social structures of the art world, and specifically of the art market, which is a very highly social and interconnected global system, which is still very strongly dependent on the one-to-one physical interactions and dealings. It's very important for the art world to be there physically. You know, if they invite me to do an exhibition and I cannot fly there, then the whole thing is kind of off. Talk to anyone in this business and they can tell you that nothing can replace that physical presence in the social event, the vernissage, where so much happens. It brings me again to the conclusion that in the race of trying to establish a dominant discourse, exhibitions are more dependent of events than the event is dependent of the exhibition. Back in 2009, I wrote that in the 70s, while in the 70s the idea of alternativity consisted in opening an alternative space, a physical space, today it hinges on time. It is particularly important for a place like New York City, where real estate is so expensive that to truly do an alternative experiment in a physical space for the duration of 6 weeks is extremely difficult for most of us, reason for which most museums and galleries have to either compensate with presenting a slightly more modest and less aggressive exhibition program, one that might be more revenue generating, and experiment through which doesn't cost so much to do, which is an event, a public program. In 2004, Grant Kester already recognized in his book, Conversation Pieces, the impulse by many artists in what was then the nascent genre of social practice of basing their work in simple human exchanges. But in contrast of relational aesthetics, these exchanges wanted to go a bit deeper. And conversation was not meant to be just empty talk, but meaningful listening. It was a common approach. In this case, not the public program, but the private program later engaging a public. I also want to point out that the idea of conversation as exhibition is emerging amongst young curators. And an interesting example to me is the Italian curator Alessandro Facente, who has promoted the term curaticism and sought to propose the idea of spoken word exhibitions in the form of studio visits and daily writing, in the form of a public talk, and then articles published forward. So what he does is, as an exhibition, he creates these groups of people that speak together. Okay? And a word on the educational turn. I have often argued that the art world, as much as it praises itself of progressive and liberal thinking, rather operates in very conservative ways when it comes especially to structuring its discourse. In my book, Art Scenes, I somehow speculate that this has to do with the regulatory role of the academic character in art history and curating, those who are charged with containing, giving shape, meaning a particular moment. It seems logical that we would turn to more traditional formats to make sense of the complexities of the contemporary art practice, for example, while employing more experimental methods, maybe too inappropriate or dangerous. Some might accuse the curator also of behaving like an artist. But speaking from the educational perspective strictly, it appears to me that the curatorial discipline can benefit from understanding that the public program has many languages, methods, and approaches, as there are educational philosophies, and of course in the same way in which there are many different kinds of artistic practices. So in the same way in which we as curators need to be open and sensitive to this diversity of our practices, we cannot stick with one traditional way of reading them. We are basically interpreters, and our success may hinge on how successfully we can employ a variety of tools to understand them. The public program offers a huge variety of formats, approaches, and structures using time, size of audiences, and other elements. Furthermore, the successful construction of communication is not an entirely subjective process, and there are reasons why the 21st century classroom is different from the 19th century version. And this to me was the problem with the so-called educational turn in curating, which took place in the art world around a decade ago. From the way I see it, there was a recognition that art had a wider mission than serving the reduced and selected art-informed elite. Curators wanted to embrace the pedagogical function of art, But the problem was, the idea was embracing all models of education, mostly hierarchical, top-down, unidirectional, earnest in its generosity, but at the same time self-centered, focusing on the audience as a passive consumer and validator of their importance. If the objective of a public program is the production of knowledge, then a production process needs to be in place. It is not the emission of information, but an actual exchange where input generated results in new collective insights. And by the way, this anthology did not include a single educator. Now, a word about time. I'm almost done. I remember the veteran MoMA curator, Kineston McShine, who famously curated the information exhibition of 1970, who in a conversation we were talking about the relationship between performance and painting. And we were talking about the common statement that painting is easier to absorb than time-based art, given that the viewer might not be able to commit, say, 1 hour to a performance, while a painting can be seen in a few seconds. He disagreed, saying that they are not equivalent forms of time. This is a Bergsonian position with which I completely agree, as in Henry Bergson, who argued that internal temporalities can never be ruled by external parameters. There's a Spanish children's story written 100 years ago that I was told as a kid, again going back to the biographical, that describes this problem very well. A young king wants to see an image of paradise. He's very powerful, he has done everything, has seen everything, but he has not seen paradise. He manages to get a wizard to give him that possibility. But the wizard warns him that he can only see paradise for 1 second. He takes him to a place where he can peek through a curtain and see paradise. The king opens a curtain and looks in, and it's a fascinating view. The wizard quickly pulls him away. When he comes out, the king is unrecognizable to his subjects. He's now an ancient man. His vision of paradise, which lasted maybe 2 or 3 seconds for him, actually had lasted a century for us. The metaphor of the story is meaningful to me because, again, following the ideas of Henri Bergson, I believe that the old preconceptions of temporality are quickly falling apart before us. There is no reason why an exhibition should last 6 weeks. There might be practical or promotional reasons, or for that matter, for a performance to last 1 hour. I had the honor to organize what I believe was the last performance by Nam June Paik, done during his retrospective at the Guggenheim Museum in 2000, in the big retrospective curated by John Hanhart, The Worlds of Nam June Paik, fantastic exhibition. And John managed to convince Nam June to perform, which was unheard of and incredible. He was already wheelchair bound. It was an incredible event, or it was, the anticipation to the event was incredible. Hundreds of people came, TV cameras lined up the auditorium, sold out months in advance. The artist requested a piano on stage. He approached the piano on a wheelchair, banged it for maybe 2 minutes, and then he said, "Let's go home." It was over in less than 5 minutes. Something that was planned for months and months in advance. Curator John Hanhart said, "This is so Fluxus." And the event was indeed one of the most memorable of any I have ever been involved in. It was not about duration. It was about experience. Francisco de Quevedo, perhaps the greatest poet of the Spanish language, put it very well when he wrote the lines, "Lo fugitivo permanece y dura." The ephemeral is long and lasting. In these first decades of the 21st century, you might have noticed that certain ideas are becoming clear. The Museum of the Future is not a big museum, but the smaller museum. The artwork that is most discussed is not dependent of time, but the one that reaches the greatest depth of experience. Human scale matters. And finally, the importance of vicarious experience. How much are we affected by things we never saw while being physically present? This is where social media might play a vital role, although I don't know the answer to that question. But I believe that those events, actions, artworks that we never saw, and I say this was as an artist who mostly was shaped by an art history of performance and conceptual art that I never saw on my own, looking at black and white photographs that nonetheless changed my way of thinking about art. All these ideas set the stage, pun intended, for the brief performance act, the ephemeral public program as a fuel of alternativity. It can be brief and intense like a flash mob, but hopefully with a bit more intention than simply a tribal gathering. It can be durational and challenge our typical tolerance for attention, but it doesn't have to depend on a long period of time to become meaningful. The reality is that we are producers, curators, artists, and cultural agents in the age of the 24-hour news cycle, of the constant stream of information in social media. And even if we want to challenge the parameters of time imposed on us, we also need to learn to adapt to them to suit our needs and capabilities. A few months ago, I organized a conference in Prague. I could only be there for one day, so my proposal to them was to do a 1-hour conference. It was titled the Mayfly Conference, which I will explain why. Through a combinatory process that I worked with Hunter students last week, the participants structured a discussion on issues that were important to them in matters of minutes, which brings me back to the image of the beginning. This is an engraving by Albrecht Dürer, as I said, from 1495, and it is entitled The Holy Family with the Mayfly. The reason being that on the lower corner of the image, you can see a little insect. The insect sometimes has been identified as a dragonfly, sometimes as a butterfly, but if you look carefully, you might be able to see how it actually looks a little different, and some will argue has the characteristics of the mayfly. Why would Dürer put this insect in the picture? And if you have studied Renaissance art, as I'm sure you have, you will know that everything has a meaning in this kind of paintings and etchings. The mayfly is a unique being that is normally caught in lakes and rivers, and is used for fishing. They spend their time hatching in the water as larvae, where they can be for many years, in contrast to their actual life. They actually are the beings that live the shortest amount of time. They can only live for a few hours. In the etching, the mayfly may serve as a metaphor of heaven and earth, of the elements, something that interested Dürer. He might as well have been wanted to reference that the terrestrial life is very brief, as was the terrestrial life of Christ himself. And finally, it might have referenced the resurrection, as a caterpillar goes from that dormant state to its adult flying version. But what the metaphor of the mayfly can serve to us, perhaps, is first to recognize the two forces that tend to shape and imprison our thinking. One, the idea of time as a resource, and two, the perception of truth as fixed. It is necessary for us in the age of late capitalism to assign a value to every single thing in the world, even time. Time is money. And things need a definition. You need to know what it is, what it means, as soon as possible. It is a principle of marketing that you don't know. If you don't know what it is, you can't market it, you can't buy it, it's useless. But the point is that the world was not built that way, is not built that way. Life and nature exist in a continuum, where even the ideas of life and death are not entirely clear. Is the unborn mayfly dead during the years of gestation, for instance? The binary propositions of language are the things that limit us, that force us to make the choices between black and white. So our critical mechanism as artists and as cultural producers is to embrace processes of questioning, of actions, of process, which constitute life cognitive experiences. This is the short and happy life of the public program. It's self-awareness, it's ephemerality, or knowledge that we only have some precious minutes to reflect together on that idea together. The awareness that we'll consider valuable in this moment will probably not be valuable 10, 15, 20 years from now. But the experience is there, it happens, we experience it, and then we go to the back of the theater and turn off the lights. I conclude with a poem by Emily Dickinson, who best, I think, summarizes this idea. In this short life that only lasts an hour, how much, how little is within our power. Thank you. You want to take questions?
So Pablo will take questions from you, and I can start with one?
Sure.
Is that okay? And there's one I want to ask, but I won't until it's later. But, right, language does a couple of different things in your talk. Or I could say, in relation to the public programming. On one hand, towards the end, language figures in relation to experience and to the ephemeral event as a kind of, either as a blockage or a reduction. But on the other hand, it is, at least in relation to public programming within arts institutions, within the museum, the primary delivery system for those programs. And so I guess what I would want you to talk a little bit more about language as event and language as it were, apparatus, explanation. And then the other thing I wonder is whether, one of the things you were describing, I think clearly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is the relationship between language, the spoken word, explanation, explication, poetry, whatever, and as it were, the framed or static object, versus language that takes the place of that.
Mm-hmm.
As art performance or as, so, and then I'll sit down, but then afterwards, people have better questions.
Well, this is a tough question. But what I would say is, in my experience in museums, there's of course like the profession of the curator and anybody who works in a museum is one of the primary tenets is to respect the art, right? To protect, respect the autonomy of the work. And the work can be anything. It can be a crazy screaming, like a Yoko Ono's like screaming in a microphone, or it can be this or it could be that, but it's contained within that conceptual frame. This is the work. And whatever is outside of it, has to actually be, it has to behave in a very regimented form. And that regimented form usually is the traditional lecture, the catalog essay, and the general behavior of us as interpreters, presenters of the work. Because I think that formal presentation and that very like a structured, stable platform allows the work to be crazy, and also in a way might give validation. If we are like, if we were like dirty and we would show up in jeans and I don't know, and behaved inappropriately in front of the work, perhaps it might be seen that we're not serious about the art that we take care of, and that I think that the reverence toward art kind of creates these sort of circumstances. So it's not mean-spirited, but it results in a very structured, very formal presentations of art. And I think that's where there's a contrast between the work as something poetic and language as something very structured and traditional. However, what I've learned as an educator is that sometimes you do have to take risks, and like the only way to really arrive to deeper understandings of work is by breaking those rules, by taking people from those scripted formats of presentation, by forcing the lecturer not to do the typical CAA style, delivery, by creating formats that might not be the ones that will be predictable, because you might actually gain some insights from that. So I think the challenge for us is to really how can we continue to be a support and a platform for this kind of unstable but rich expressions, and at the same time be creative and provide powerful insights to the people that want to engage with the work. Does that make sense?
I ask another question?
Yeah, yeah.
And this one you can tell me if you don't want to answer it. You suggested that the future of the museum and a certain kind of museum experience was the small museum, which you currently don't work at.
I'm doomed. So you want me to elaborate on that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. How many of you saw This Is Progress by Tino Segal? At the Guggenheim Museum, was it like 3 years ago? Was it 5 years ago? Really, years ago? I don't know. Well, some of you were actually there. The Guggenheim produced this wonderful piece by the artist, German artist Tino Segal, who's known by doing these performative interventions, right? And he works with actors. You can photograph the work. It's very unusual, really, in the way that he approaches it and the way he even manages the sale of the works. You would enter the Guggenheim Museum. The museum was completely empty, by the way. You would enter the rotunda, and as you know, there's like the big spiral that goes, the ramps that go all the way up, and then you will be approached by a child who would ask you, "Can you tell me what's progress?" And then you start going up the ramp with this kid, and maybe like an 8 or 10-year-old, I don't know, start talking about trying to explain to the kid what does progress mean, you know? And then you are kind of like making yourself kind of, caught in convoluted explanations, what progress is like, civilization. And then a teenager suddenly appears and replaces the kid, when you're kind of like on the first floor. This is like a 14-year-old or 15-year-old, and can you tell me what's progress? And then you start the conversation with the kid. And it's so cool. Then you have like, a guy or a woman in her 20s and then college age, and then someone who's like in their 30s and their 40s, and then at the end you get somebody who's like a senior, their 60s or so, telling you a story about something that happened to a friend. And then toward the very end, that last person tells you, "This is Progress" by Tino Segal. Goodbye. What was really fascinating to me about that experience was that I felt I had attended an education program, but that nobody would actually tell me that. Like, this is not art, this is education. And that's what it. Yeah, I mean, that's something that I would have done as an educator. I would have loved to do as an educator. Of course, breaking the rules of like the art and educator. But what also made me reflect was how, I became fascinated by the process by which the Guggenheim had to produce this piece. It was an incredibly difficult project. They had to hire or actually engage, I think it was volunteers that participated, but maybe like 100 volunteers that agreed to do this thing. And the experience was incredible. But just imagine what it would be like to provide this level of one-to-one experience conversation, to thousands of people that come to the museum every day. It's practically impossible. And yet, that is what a meaningful experience is all about. So that the main discomfort or problem that many visitors have when they come to the museum is that they feel it's impersonal, they feel it's corporate, they feel it's elitist. And I have developed with my colleagues in education countless proofs and research that the moment that you engage a visitor on a one-to-one basis, that not only increases their the amount of time they spend at the museum, it completely changes their experience. It's completely different when you walk into a place and somebody tells you hello, than when you walk into a place and like you feel like you're in the subway or in the airport and you don't know where the bathroom is and you don't know where anything is and you don't know what the show is about and it looks weird and you don't understand. You get frustrated and then you walk away, and that was your experience. But instead, you have somebody who welcomes you and tells you, like, "Listen, this is what it is. This is what's going on. We know it's hard, but we can help you. This is what you might want to do. This is what you might expect." It changes completely the experience. And this is, of course, my tendency as an educator to overly, try to compensate, by trying to make sure that the guest is kind of like a house guest. You're coming into somebody's house, so we want to make sure that people are well received and well attended and listened to. So this is where I think the long answer to your question about why I feel that the Museum of the Future is a smaller museum, because to amplify and maximize experience, it's not impossible, it's just very difficult to do. And I think one of the things that we have failed to anticipate in this era of the blockbuster museum is the importance of human interaction. That in the end, we can become gigantic, but we still are serving human beings, and we are small in comparison, and the time that needs to be invested in developing a relationship, even if it's small, symbolic, it's very important, and that is very difficult to amplify, and that is why when we look at successful and interesting examples, we usually, when you go to conferences about these topics, you will normally notice that these are museums that are smaller in scale. They're not huge blockbuster museums. Or they produced smaller programs that are successful in themselves because they do work with smaller groups of people. And that's one thing that I wish we had more in mind when we are thinking about the future of the museum.
Can I ask one more question?
Sure, of course.
One-to-one relationship.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems when I go to the modern, and I'm not picking on the modern, but when I go to the modern, what I want to do is to say to people, go look at Matisse's Yellow Curtain, and then look kind of just look at it, stand there. Now, look at the upper right-hand corner a little bit in the way kind of that color cuts into this other color.
You tell this to your students?
Yeah.
Or whoever comes with you?
Yeah.
Yes.
Or mostly I just stand in front of it and wait. I'm not
You become a museum educator.
I don't open my mouth. I try to telepathically say, look at that. Which strikes me as one of the things that people don't tend to do in museums. Which may be an elitist and terrible thing for me to say, but it's like looking at.
No, I mean, I think you're pointing out an important thing. It's true. I mean, it's the tendency, the generalized tendency of the regular museum visitor is unfortunately to consume art in the same way that we consume everything else, in the same way that we watch television, And it is not unusual to see many people just like this, taking pictures of every single thing they look at. I mean, I remember seeing a guy who basically took every single picture. I mean, he just walked to the gallery to just take a picture of every single artwork in the gallery, but he did not look at them. He just basically pointed and shoot everything and then walked away. So that takes maybe 60 seconds to do. But he really looked at the show. It was like a very almost instinctive approach, and so it does take time and energy, and because if you're not a regular viewer or a professional, someone who lives in the art world like we do, it is difficult to deal with these things, and many people don't pay attention. So what we try to do is to create systems or ways by which we can invite them to look harder, and to take a look that things are not that easy, that they're not that simple. Looking at Reinhardt, it's really important to really sit there and look for a while, because things start changing, but when you don't have the knowledge that that's possible, then you simply walk away, and that's why slowing the visitor is, to me, absolutely key and central for the viewing experience. Whether you slow this person by talking about something that is connected to what this work is about, or doing an experience. Once I did an experiment where we were in the Cubist galleries, and we were simply experimenting. I brought with me a Gertrude Stein play. And Gertrude Stein plays, if you have ever read them, they're completely crazy. This one is like a 4-page play with 40 characters. So I basically started inviting the visitors to read one of the roles. You know? And then before we knew it, we had like 20 people reading the play at the Cubist galleries. And people loved the experience. And then after that, we talked about the works and Stein's connection to Picasso and Braque and her own work as a writer and the relation to Cubism, to literature, and I mean, many different interesting things. But that would have never happened had we not created that incident, let's say, that triggered other reflections or insights. You know, or people will have not stopped to do in the Cubist galleries to do anything else, basically taking a snapshot and walk away.
Why aren't there more Tino Segal type art performances? Why is that so unique? I mean, it was terrific.
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't?
I think it's a good question, and I think museums today in the 21st century are struggling to make that happen more. But the thing is, you know, we come from the visual art tradition, which does have this history of static spaces. You know, the white cube, the idea that a museum is just this building with white galleries, and you put the artworks there, and this whole idea that the process-based art or performance is important is fairly new, and you always see that performance departments in museums are fairly small, you know, and they don't have enough resources, and they're always struggling to like make things happen. And usually they're really exciting things like the Tino Segal performance, but we are kind of like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, you know, because the museums are not production companies. They are not, in a certain way you could say, well, you know, if BAM produced this, then it would be better. But again, you know, the traditional performing arts presenter also doesn't operate that way, because they don't do one-to-one. They do like major, like operatic level performances. So we have to learn. We have to find ways in which we can adapt to be able to support these kind of experiences. I think there's been really interesting progress. You know.
There's, you know, the art is supposed to separate the mundane from the sublime from the mundane. You look at art and get involved with art. But the structure, as you say, the structure of art, form of art, sometimes you're not transported, you know, you're not getting to the other side, you know, way. I mean, the abstract expressionists are trying to doing that. So you lose something. I mean, you go to an opera, you talk about being operatic, you go to the opera and you hear a great diva sing an aria and you just, you know, you melt, sometimes you melt. It's tougher to get that experience with visual art. And Segal really did something unique, and it's just wonder why this has not translated with other artists.
But you know, again, I think we're learning about the bottom line. I think is the museums of 50 years ago will have been very ill-equipped to deal with the art that is made today. You know, and I think we are now facing the same problem with like the art that will be important 50 years from now. That the museum of this moment is not very well suited for this kind of new forms. And in a way, that's not anything new, you know. And we might just or challenges maybe figuring out what are really the new parameters that we need to create so that this kind of art can be experienced properly. Yes.
In addition to that argument that the world is changing and that the space is changing slower, which is definitely true, is there also something to be said or talked about performance development not being funded or having the resources and things like that about the fact that performance and doesn't relate to the market as easily? I mean, museums don't really.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, I always
They're related to.
personally, I've always found very disconcerting, if not uncomfortable, that a painting might sold for millions, right? But a performance is experienced for free, and at a gallery opening. And there's this very weird contrasts of how we value certain experiences or art objects. Or you know, if you go to the opera, you pay a lot of money for those tickets. I mean, like you really are making an investment, or you pay $200 to sit there and listen to an amazing singer, right? But if I were to ask you, let's pay $200 to see this performance or piece that's in the gallery next door, you'll be like, are you crazy? We're not the Namjoon paid performance. People pay $10 to walk in. And that was considered one of the hottest tickets. So I think there's something about the economy of the performance of the conceptual art that somehow logistically we are falling short in supporting, and we still haven't really figured it out, But I do think that it's something that curators are aware about, that the institutions are aware about, and it is interesting to see how there are more and more organizations or agencies, public art programs. Just what I find really interesting and maybe exciting is that Tom Finkelberg, who is the new commissioner for New York City, who was the director of the Queens Museum, has recently announced that the Percent for Art initiative will also encompass social practice, which I find really exciting. Who knows what that means, But it is very interesting that, in a way, what Mirli Landerman-Yukeles did on her own in the 60s by declaring herself, the resident artist of the Department of Sanitation, now can actually be supported by the city in a more formal way. That's an incredible thing, and I think we will be seeing a lot of these things happening more and more over the course of the next few years.
I just wanted to touch back on feeling too, because I think that people are not used to paying for feelings of discomfort or feelings of uncertainty, and I think that the sort of amazing thing about the Museum Education Department is that you can force people to have, or not force, but like encourage people to have difficult discussions, or maybe have unexpected discussions or unexpected results from the discussions. And in some ways, it's like really difficult to get people to buy in the beginning that that's what they're actually about to do. Yeah. Is to like get uncomfortable, like get ready, like who would pay like even
discomfort
$10
spa
to get like uncomfortable? Like,
I know. But that's an excellent point. I mean, at the same time, we go to see horror films, right? We go see a lot of things that we know are not going to be depressing or difficult. Or you read a novel that's going to make you super depressed, or we read stories of that we know are difficult, but we do it because we know that there's something valuable in it, because it's maybe told beautifully, or because it's a very powerful story that you need to learn. And yes, so I think that the preconceptions that we need to defeat about art is that you just go there to have fun, or that fun is just this kind of fun that is going to go to a party. But what we want to is amplify what pleasure can mean. Because when you're reading a sad story, it doesn't mean that you're suffering only. You're also enjoying in a certain way, like you're enjoying the poetry or the way that the story is being told. If you cry at a movie, it's not because it's terrible. It might be because it's terrible, but might also be because it's a very compelling story that is really moving you. And you want to do that. So you want to be moved, your emotions. And I think we can do that. But I think we do need to change those perceptions that, we're just going to go there for entertainment in that narrow sense. It seems to me.
So how do you change people's mind about that? Is there any way that...
Well, I mean, as an educator, I do feel that education is often put in the service sector mentality of like, I'm just a server serving you French fries and a cheeseburger. Right? And people, the person who tells you, just tell me what it is, they just want a cheeseburger. Yep. So maybe I can just give them something a little different, first, to try. Well, try this first, And then I feel that as, the process of education can also encourage you to discover new things, and also be more open to even those discomforts. Even the person that tells me, like, I hate this art, my 4-year-old could have done it, I think that's a great start of a conversation. Because I know that person is really having a strong reaction toward that work. They feel strongly about it. Indifference is much worse to deal with. Somebody who just doesn't care. But the one that tells you, like, I really don't like this, something has, like, provoked this person. Something has made them want to really argue about it. And that is a fantastic way to start. So I think that there's many strategies in which you can lure someone who is expecting to have a particular experience into going to a different experience. I mean, it's kind of the sleight of hand that magicians have, where you have a coin here and suddenly the coin is here. And we do it in a variety of different ways. And I think, yes, we have to insert a certain level of discomfort. It just comes with the business. But not so much to the point that you're going to completely alienate that person and make them walk away, but that show them that it's not that simple, but it's not that easy, and it's not that complicated either. So it becomes, in a way, almost a process of almost like dating, of kind of like a seduction, of like, let me show you how interesting this is, and it's worth it. Yeah.
Your role as an educator in art institutions compared to your role as an educator in academic institutions, and what your experience has been challenging, or challenging what you have been, in art institutions, but room for challenging what's possible.
Well, yeah, I mean, I really respect Academy, and and I teach regularly, and I do things like this, like lecture. This was a lecture, but I really love the way that the museum is this space of informal learning. That the museum is this wonderful environment where, in general, when I walk into the museum and walk around the galleries, the people that I see around, they're pretty happy. They're not upset about the work. I mean, every now and then somebody objects about something, but in general, it's a really fulfilling experience for most people, and it is a learning experience, even if they do not realize it. If you really look at studies of learning, the formal learning that we receive in our lifetimes is very, very small. This big graph, like a little square like this, is actually your formal education. Everything else is the stuff that you have learned on your own, and we never stop learning, from the moment we're born until, the moment we die. It's a never-ending process. And I think the museum can really fulfill a really important function in making us think about things in ways that we never really thought about. And in the art museum, like I said here, can provide experiences that at an emotional level, at sensorial levels, that can make us sensitive to topics that maybe later we can explore in more formal ways, but that we can connect with those audiences in those very primal forms. So I think there's much to be explored in that sort of informal capacity. And that doesn't really replace necessarily or contradict what is really like more formal learning, or formal research, which I think it has to be done. Somebody has to do it, and many of us have to do it. Really try to understand what something is, what is the history of it, what are the ideas around it, and that becomes kind of like a more technical and specialized form of understanding the thing, But art is this thing that it includes the very dedicated understanding, that many of us do almost like as a religious thing, and it also is this wealth of that is there for everybody to explore. It's a great thing about art, that it can really encompass everyone, that it can really be, it can become significant for an entire population, and it can become a treasure. It can become like poetry, like one single image can really etch into the minds of an entire generation, and that is something that is not done formally. It just happens. It's lived. It's a lived experience.
Well, maybe on lived experience, which is always a good thing to take with you. Why don't you join me in thanking Pablo Helgura?
Thank you so much.